Welcome, everyone, to the practitioner track. I want to introduce Dr. Mark Chockalingham. He's the president and CEO of Valtitude, a supply chain consultancy that specializes in helping companies implement best practices in demand forecasting and S&OP. He has over 20 years of experience in consulting and corporate in the areas of predictive analytics, sales forecasting, supply chain optimization, and integrated business planning. Mark's primary focus is on helping clients with usable planning solutions, having engineered processes and systems for many Fortune 500 companies, including Wyeth Pfizer, Miller SAB, FMC, Pepsi Foods, Schlumberger, Facebook, Qualcomm, Abbott, M&M Mars, and more. Prior to establishing his consultancy, Mark worked in key supply chain positions in FedEx, Merck, and at Gillette P&G. Mark edits the forecastingblog.com and provides thought leadership on LinkedIn, so please connect with him there. He has a PhD in finance from Arizona State University, an MBA from the University of Toledo, and is a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. Mark's mantra has been to provide consulting that addresses all three important dimensions: process, analytics, and systems, so the end product to the client is usable and sustainable. Welcome, Mark Chockalingham.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. So, good. So this is a nice group. Probably one of the smallest groups I've ever talked to, but that's okay. I understand I'm day 3. Exactly, right? So you can pepper me with questions anytime. You can hear this, right? That's all good? Okay. Yeah, that's actually good. So that way we can keep it more interactive, right? And I know everybody in the audience today, so. Okay, very good, very good. So thanks, Mike, for the introduction. We pride ourselves, and I pride myself on providing usable solutions to clients, right? So, we work with Kinaxis now, right? Kinaxis, we have worked with SAP for a long time. So at the end of the day, corporations, they have a variety of tools, they have complicated processes, but at the end of the day, they have to deliver the goods, right? And that's where all this confusion sets in, because our clients have Kinaxis, they have SAP, they have Demantra, they have everything, right? Some of the clients have all the tools. So that's why I think usability is important. I wish most of the consulting firms actually focus on that, right? To improve usability of both processes as well as solutions. Anyway, so S&OE, Sales and Operations Execution, has been, it has become like a really nice buzzword, at least off late, right? And with a good purpose. So I know machine learning is big, neural networks, deep learning is also big. But from a process side, S&OP, S&OP obviously rules, right? Because companies need S&OP for sure. Lately, S&OE, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, has been gaining a lot of traction. In fact, somebody sent me a question through email. I know about S&OP, right? And I am hearing about S&OE, and there is a lot of confusion. In fact, there's a friend of mine, Jonathan, right, who couldn't make it to the conference, right? Jonathan Carolis. So, I really want to know what the difference is, because my clients are asking me what S&OE is, right? So, mostly in the pandemic, right, last 2 years, what did we experience? We experienced supply shortages, right? Big supply shortages. And then along with that, all the governments and the central banks, Federal Reserve, they pumped in a lot of money. So people rich with cash, the demand also surged. Demand went up. So you have supply shortages on the one hand, and sudden unexpected spikes in demand, right? Something that you cannot model, right? Even with scenario planning, even with all of the stuff that I'm hearing, right? MLPs, RNNs, CNNs, any of these things, you still cannot project any of this, right? Because people were not prepared, and that's why we have shortages. Because if these models have really worked and forecasted this, we probably would be in much better shape, right? But really, at the end of the day, we all know that it's a forecast after all. Anything could change. So basically, companies were faced with a situation where they had to meet unexpected spikes. Now, they also have supply uncertainty, right? So they have to be very nimble about this. And the S&OP is a long-term planning solution, right? It has to be long-term. It has to be, 13 weeks ahead, right? So it has to be 4 months to 18 months, or 4 months to 24 months. That's the S&OP. So basically, you know, um, so when you look at demand and supply, you need a framework to address these very quickly. And one thing that has evolved, at least in the last 10 years, was something called as demand sensing. I'm sure most of you are familiar, right? Demand sensing. So demand sensing is a practice where you just look at demand and how demand evolves compared to the forecast to see how you can adjust the forecast really quickly within the horizon, right? That's the purpose of demand sensing. So when you look at this, you can just think of, okay, demand sensing is also a component of S&OE. And when I looked at how the S&OP is executed in a number of companies, since obviously, some of these S&OPs were implemented, a while ago, then it kind of morphs, right? It evolves over time. And people kind of just take it by the horns and change as they go along. And there is a lot of short-term reactionary decisions that take place within the S&OP framework. I even see people actually pass forecasts, right? Monthly forecasts, revised monthly forecasts every week. Sometimes they want a new forecast almost every day in some of these companies. And to me, it doesn't make sense at all, right? Why would you want to look at a forecast when you even have a real demand signal that's out there? Because you have orders, order stream that's out there over the next, I would say next 15 days or even a month, because customers place orders, they want product, ahead of, they want product into the future. They don't want it shipped today. So basically, when you look at S&OE is, I am going to look at this. I'm going to look at the changes that trigger either a forecast change or a supply change, and how do I formalize this and address this in the framework, right? So I'm just going to skip over some of the marketing slides here. So this is kind of like the current state, right? I can look at the screen here. So if you look at it, overall, MPS, master production scheduling. If you look at overall how the different touch points work within supply chain planning, you have the business planning process. It could be a strategic planning, it has many objectives, right? A business plan could be a budget, could be an integrated business plan, output of the IBP process, right? And that drives the aggregate S&OP process, aggregate process, which is the sales and operations planning process. The time frame for sales and operations planning is the longer term horizon, right? Typically monthly buckets, and it's it's between the target horizon is between 4 months and 24 months, right? Longer term planning. Some S&OPs could even have horizons of 5 years, right? So it's a strategic planning process. And if you look at business planning is somewhat annual to 2 years, right? But you also have a separate strategic planning process. So essentially, when it comes to production planning, the production planning process would have a shorter horizon, right? Now, once the demand forecast is pushed to supply planning, then that gets into master production scheduling, right? So the master production schedule, yes, question? No, please. Since it's a small group, interrupt me.
Planning and execution might have shrunk from, a few times a year to monthly. But especially like in the CPG space, we saw people going from monthly to weekly, even to daily, and occasionally for some products, even hourly. So I certainly agree that this is the general framework. Did you see that behavior in the clients you worked with? And how does that change, just as you go, how does that change the picture of the world you're painting?
Right. So this is the general framework as it exists, right? Basically, you have the long-term planning that feeds into the master production schedule, right? Through the demand plan, which is just passed monthly, typically. And then sometimes it could be twice a month, right? So they could just pass one, in the first week of the month, and then they could pass a final revised plan third week of the month after the S&OP is all done, right? That's a typical process. Then the master production schedule takes all these inputs and then comes out, lays out, a huge plan, a mother of all plans, basically, that says, okay, this is what we want in terms of production and the production lines. These is how many trucks we need, that type of stuff, right? It just feeds into everything. Warehouse capacity, factory production, everything, right? Now, what you're saying is within the S&OP framework, they have kind of increased the frequency of the pass. So basically, they have kind of, amalgamated the short-term planning process and the long-term planning process together, and that's the purpose of the S&OE. So today, you have this, and the master production schedule is supposed to drive everything, and it is a process. But then, in practice, over the years, it has actually just become a document, right? It just, you have a document, you have a master production schedule, Excel spreadsheet, what have you, that's given to everyone, but the individual functions were operating in silos, basically, right? So, I have been asked this question, particularly on LinkedIn, is this a new buzzword? It's really S&OE is just, is it master production scheduling, right? So master production scheduling has been around a long time. And in fact, that's the best practice process, right? You have a master production schedule that pretty much feeds the entire supply chain planning process for different functions. But in practice, what happens is, we have seen this everywhere. In practice, what happens is individual functions take the master production schedule, work in silos. Production planners will come up with what they can produce. Schedulers will come up with in a daily schedule, right, for production purposes, factory floor. Warehouse operation, in fact, I have seen warehouse operations develop their own siloed forecast based on past activity, right? Just a simple time series forecast in terms of, okay, what did we do in the past? And that's what we would use to do the forecast. And buyers, they do their own stuff as well. So now reacting, basically just coming up with a solution that says, well, I'm having problems here at the tactical level. So I am going to pass this plan more frequently is only going to increase the chaos, right? Because, what is that going to do? If you have a plan, if you know how you execute that plan, and you have a process, a holistic framework, that's much better than addressing the problem with saying, I'm going to forecast every day now, right? I don't believe that's going to improve much, forecasting every day. In fact, actually, I just see a general larger consensus here that we should forecast less, not more, right? At least in this conference. So, S&OP feeds the MPS, master production schedule. And then master production schedule drives the operational planning process, right? Operational planning, forecasting, and scheduling. So now when you have shocks here, right, which is information that you get more frequently, and if your solution is to forecast more frequently, then you're still going to have a lot of fires, right? Because that is only going to create additional shocks without really addressing the specific fire. Okay, now the solution is, I know there is a trigger, right? I know these are the challenges here, exceptions here. How do I address these exceptions instead of reforecasting, right? So, so this is a chart from Wallace and Stahl. Probably most of you are familiar with it from the S&OP book, if you think about it, right? So you have, we talked about different plannings, right? Different planning processes. You have the strategic planning, you have business planning, and then you have the sales and operations planning, which kind of sits in the middle between tactical planning and long-term planning, right? And the idea of the sales and operations plan is to balance demand and supply, right? Is to balance demand and supply. So S&OP is an aggregate plan. It deals with volume imbalances, and it also has, mixed information as well. But generally, it's an aggregate plan. So, and the way it is executed is through master scheduling. That's where the mix comes in, right? So the sales and operations execution process really focuses here in this part of the demand-supply balancing process. So the idea here is, right, if you have demand shocks or supply shocks, And the only way to deal with that is through revisiting the S&OP and changing your operating plan, S&OP plan, right? Then what happens is the resources that are involved in the S&OP, who are supposed to be focused long-term, right? Who are supposed to be focused long-term, they're going to be drawn into the firefighting. They're going to be spending their time in terms of firefighting, balancing demand and supply. So you need a process. So the short-term process, it has evolved. Many companies have it, but it's kind of like not formalized. And they have compromised the S&OP process on, on the way, right? So basically, S&OE is just more than MPS, because MPS now has become a document. So S&OE is a tactical planning process to align and balance demand and supply intersections, okay? So cross-functional, it involves pretty much every function: sales, product management, demand planning, supply planning, production planning, detailed scheduling, warehousing and shipping, and customer service. So all of these functions are involved in the S&OE process. Weekly cycle. So S&OP is a monthly cycle, right? S&OP once a month. S&OE is weekly cycle. It's focused on the next 13 weeks, right? So compared to S&OP, which is focused on the next 2 years almost, right? Next 2 years, even 5 years. So S&OP is a long-term horizon. S&OE is focused on the next 13 weeks only. And it reviews both unconstrained and constrained plans, because that is the output of the master production schedule. Because the master production schedule takes the demand forecast and then comes up with what is feasible, a feasible production plan, master plan, and addresses demand and supply imbalances through constant interdisciplinary, cross-functional communication and structured meetings. So companies have all these fire drills that take place almost every week. Now it's more formalized. Like every meeting has a purpose, a function, and specific objective to solve, right? So it enables the execution of the S&OP plan through demand control, supply changes, and holistic readjustments of plans to address exceptions, right? So each function has a responsibility: demand control on the demand side. So potentially addressing demand exceptions. You could just do a variety of things: shifting demand, right? Or basically addressing customers that really need the product versus customers who have plenty of inventory. So those type of demand control exceptions. We wouldn't go into too much detail here. And supply changes, typically, allocating resources, based on any type of supply information or demand information. What can I readjust, right? Like the scenario planning that we do overall in different solutions, right? And then readjustment of the plan to address exceptions. So the readjustment of the plan, the master plan here, may have a feedback loop back into S&OP. And that's what you communicate back to S&OP. Instead of constantly learning from this and constantly changing the S&OP plan, if you continue to do that without the S&OE, you're going to make the S&OP a tactical plan, right? So that's going to be the problem. I mean, pandemic has changed many things. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Okay, so pandemic has changed many things, right? Even how we live, how we travel, many things. And we we don't want it to change S&OP also. Maybe it changes S&OP for the good with the addition of the right processes, right? So S&OE, in terms of the bridging to the S&OP, if you look at it, there is a 4 weeks. The 4 weeks is the as-is zone, right? So which means you cannot change much in the 4-week period, right? So it's pretty much as is. You still have some things that you need to focus on, but it's pretty much as is, right? And then the 13-week period is the realignment zone. You could change things in 13 weeks, short term, making changes to supply, making changes to demand, what have you. And then you have the 4 to 18 months, longer, 24 months maybe even, right? That is the S&OP horizon, right? Sales and operations planning. So in summary, you could say the sales and operations execution is really an execution of the MPS with the series of structured meetings that are aligned as part of the overall tactical process. It is actually tactical planning, but you have specific structured meetings with purpose and objectives, right? So you're really trying to formalize all this, and companies are doing this, as I said, right? But kind of in an ad hoc, chaotic framework, right? So really three things. You need the master production schedule. That's the input to the S&OE, right? You need that. And a series of tactical meetings, structured meetings with specific purpose. And a live update of the schedule. So, I have seen this happen in a number of companies where they have the master production schedule and individually functions work on this, and they adjust this once a month, the master production schedule, right? They come back and then say, hey, this is what we're going to do, and these are the exceptions, and this is how we are going to deal with, right? But the document stays stale. It is not updated, right? It's not updated. They use the same document, but then they keep making adjustments based on, just meetings and informal communication. So with the tools that we have, you could make a live update of the schedule, the master production schedule, right? So planning horizons again, to revisit, right? So you have S&OE, right? Basically, some of the changes could happen in the first 13 to 16 weeks, right? Tactical, executional focus. S&OP is mid to long-term critical for production capacity planning, long-term, right? Capacity planning. Now, this is the zone where actually S&OE and S&OP meet, right? So the as-is and tactical, it's all like detail, demand fulfillment, detail level, SKU customer, right? So demand fulfillment happens at the detail level. So this is all execution. And this is where the planning horizon is. Basically, there is an intersection between S&OE and S&OP. Okay? So you have S&OE, daily plans and schedules. S&OP is balancing supply and demand plans and align operations over the long term. And there is a management, this is a management process, right? So senior management is involved in S&OP. And S&OE is tactical. You would say mid-management, middle management is involved in, functional execution level folks are involved in the S&OE, right? And obviously the strategic plan has to drive both S&OE and S&OP, okay? So let's just go into the details a little bit. I think it's, yeah. Okay? So over the 13 weeks, right? Over the 13 weeks, what happens? So what happens in different weeks? So I said the first 3 to 4 weeks is really kind of as is, almost as is, right? And the week one, you cannot do anything. Week one is all focused on execution, flawless execution, order fulfillment, unbiased metrics, right? And then assess the impact based on what happened, right? Any imbalances in demand supply, assess the impact to the upcoming 13 weeks, next 8 weeks, right? Next 8 to 13 weeks. So who is responsible? Customer service for order fulfillment, supply planners, warehouse, because everything is tactical execution. The idea here is we learn from these execution exceptions, right? And that goes into the meetings. So week 2 to 5, right? Supply shortages. So this is essentially the planning horizon in different weeks. We are not just saying, okay, in week 2 to 5, this is what you do. Every week you do this, right? Every week we do this. But what can we address in week 1 and what can we address in week 2 to 5? So I'm sitting here today, this week, I'm doing the S&OE. And my focus for the week 2 to 5 would be this. And week 6 to 12 would be this. This is what I can address for the 6 to 12 week demand, what I'm expecting, right? And this is the week 13, right? But every week I'm going to address all of these, right? Every week I'm going to have meetings. So weeks 2 to 5, unexpected changes to demand. I'm sorry, unexpected changes to supply, not demand. Unexpected changes to supply. So if there is a supply issue, I can address it, right? Week 2 to 5. something that's coming up, I want to address it. And warehouse issues, inventory availability, production issues, all of these issues that are kind of flagged up, right, based on today or this week, those I can address, the next 2 to 5 weeks, yes.
So when you're segmenting supply changes in weeks 2 to 5 and demand changes in weeks 2 to 6, naturally you can have demand changes in weeks 2 to 5 and supply changes in weeks 6 to 12. Are you just saying that this is when you think that it's the optimal time to address them if they come up?
Okay, that's a good question. Basically, like whatever I can do in week 2 to 5, I can actually just like do in week 6 to 12 as well, right? It's just I cannot address demand issues for the next 2 to 5, is it 2 to 5 weeks?
And is that because you're talking about being frozen or?
Yeah. Right. So at least from a planning perspective, I'm not going to go back to my sales team, or I'm not going to go back to my customers and say, I want to change it. You can't have the product. I cannot do that. You have to fulfill the demand, right? 2 to 5. The first 5 weeks, you don't want to go back and tell the demand planning team or the sales team, change the demand plan because I have a supply issue, right? Because it's done, right? Basically, it's going to be either cut, what have you, right? But beyond that, they could. I mean, I think it's the ability to react. I think you don't want to just like really take it as gospel. This is kind of one model. But depending on the company, depending on the flexibility, this could be shorter as well. Do you have a different experience where you would change the demand in the short term also?
Well, I'm just thinking when there's a significant enough disruption, if there's a hurricane that comes through, you're always going to have disruption in a supply chain. But if I think there's a difference between what could happen
Right.
and what actually does happen, that the demand spikes happen. I flew here on a plane with a winemaker from a very large corporate winery, and he was saying that of all odd things, there was a rapper who did a TikTok video about a $3 bottle of wine, and their demand like overnight went through the roof.
Right.
So yes, you can't change your structured fulfillment schedule overnight, but might you by week 5 when that happens? I mean, we've done some demand sensing where in that shorter term time horizon, we were helping companies change their replenishment strategy on a fairly quick turnaround because demand spikes. So
Right.
that's why I'm asking. I mean, yes, this is certainly an overall best practice, but when these very unexpected things happen.
True.
That's my question.
So very good point. So, let's say the TikTok rapper did this and suddenly the wine demand went up, right? So in the short term, in the next, 2 to 5 weeks, so what you could do is you have to scramble to see how you can meet the demand, right? But then the feedback would be to say, hey, we have this and it's going to be there is going to be positive momentum here. So organically, the demand may shoot up in week 6 to 12. So tell the demand team, find out what's happening, what's going to happen, and then see if you can revise the forecast, right? So right now, like whatever is happening now is already done, right? If I go back to demand planning and say, hey, the TikTok rapper is doing this stuff, why don't you redo the demand plan, send it to me right now, right? And that's what a number of companies are doing today, right? I think that's more reactionary, especially in the short term. That information has to pass back to demand and sales teams to assess what the impact is. Because it could be a one-time thing, right? Because the TikTok rapper did it, and it's here today, gone tomorrow, right? And suddenly there is a demand surge, and kind of it dissipates in the next 3-4 weeks, which means people just bought all this, they pantry loaded, right? And then that is going to borrow or draw the demand from the future, because that type of signal has to be assessed, right? So that feedback has to be provided to the demand side, right? And then say, hey, I want you to look at your forecast, 6 to 12, right? So 6 to 12, if you look at it, so there is demand sensing, demand shift versus demand growth. This is the very good example you gave today, right? The TikTok rapper and the wine demand. So the question that you have to assess, not the S&OE, but the demand planning team has to assess is this a temporary spike in demand, right? Is it a temporary spike in demand that actually draws or weakens the future demand because it's just kind of like front-loading demand? In that case, you have to take the forecast down because we don't want to be driven by this and bullwhip it, and then we continue to produce a lot of wine or bottle a lot of wine, right? Or the other thing is, oh, this actually has legs. It is going to stay. It's going to like work out for a while, right? So we are going to just ride on this momentum. And we are going to revamp our marketing plans to kind of to piggyback on this, and then so which means there's going to be organically long-term growth for our product.
So interestingly, by the way, I did ask, and apparently the demand did stick, like it stayed high for that particular product. But I think what I'm getting at is the way you segmented it, which is that yes, you don't want to increase your overall demand forecast based on something that at day 3, the day after, even a week after, you don't know if that demand's going to stick. But in the short term, you do have increased demand you want to fulfill if you can. You want to replenish if you can. And so you're not going to do that with a demand forecast. You're going to do that with an execution strategy on the replenishment side.
Which is,
Right.
So it's completely supply. So week 2 to 5 is completely supply. I learned of the TikTok rapper here week 1, and I'm just saying, hey, I'm going to do all I can to push product, move it to the warehouse it needs, and then see if I can do overtime, what have you, to do this, right? In terms of bottling and getting the stock ready. But at the same time, I need to tell my demand team, go look at this, week 6 to 12, right? And then say, how does it affect my future forecast? Because they have to make the call, whether it is organic, positive momentum, increases the demand in the future, or is it just a shift?
The other thing, just because your driver may be how much you care about stockouts. So what this guy told me is at the low end part of their business, the $3 bottles of wine, they don't care as much about stockouts. But at the high end, high margin part of their business, they carry extra inventory because they don't want to, they don't want to run. They want no stockouts. They'll keep those customers loyal. So I don't know if you're factoring that into segmenting your products based on your S&OE strategy based on the value to your business.
Oh, in terms of which one to focus on. Okay.
Could I just follow up? So I understand if you have a single spike and it's temporary, effectively ignore it. But sometimes, when we went into the pandemic, some products became much more unstable, and others less so. And I understand why you don't necessarily want to change the forecast of the mean, but what about the volatility itself, which you've mentioned there?
Right.
Is there not a case for updating the forecast of the volatility?
Forecast for volatility.
Yes, for the volatility itself. In other words, saying, yes, we expect 50, but it could be between, 40 and 60 or 10 and 90, that sort of understanding. I
think that absolutely gets into the segmentation of the products, right? Both based on volatility and margin or volume, what have you. So you could actually have, a variety of these to segment and then how the S&OE focuses on it. Very good point. I think you probably should add a slide on that. Yeah. So I think both, S&OP and S&OE, that segmentation is important, right? What they focus on is important. And then suddenly the TikTok rapper, right? Just pushes a low margin, or I don't want to say low margin, kind of a C-level product, and suddenly that becomes a cheap wine, and then everybody buys it. Now it becomes an A product, right? Purely because of the volume. Right? So absolutely, I think that has to be taken into account as well. But I do have to say though, right? This unexpected changes to demand is not really the overall volatility though. It is just a spike that's unexpected, right? That's something that you can't even model, right? It just happens. You have to address. In fact, one of the presentations, they were talking about the scenario planning, right? So I'm not sure, even if you have, any type of advanced models like neural network, deep learning, what have you, right? You still model the volatility based on what you know. But if it is unexpected, I think that is only could be handled with the scenario planning, right? You cannot handle with the existing framework because you don't really have enough information to model that volatility, right? So week 13 is where the jump off point is, right? So you flex the plans, change it, firming the SKU level demand plan, right? All of the information gets into this. And this is the bridge to feedback to S&OP, right? So week 13, essentially, you can think of that as, hey, that is the jump off point that goes to address the S&OP, right? Things can just be on the execution side or on the planning side, okay? And then S&OP, obviously, we all know S&OP, unconstrained demand plan, rough cut plan, which results in the master production schedule, capacity plan. So senior management is involved, middle management is involved in the S&OP. Okay. So this 13-week is just based on my experience, right, and working with manufacturers, right. Definitely not retail. I don't really have retail experience that much. So, and it could be different, right? We don't want to take 13 weeks as a solid, horizon for S&OE. It could be shorter, depending on what, what business you are in. Like, for example, if I think of a fast food restaurant, fast food chain, I would think this process will shrink a lot more, I think. Because even their S&OP could only be 3 months, right? So, I mean, they probably have a long-term planning process, but they really need to focus on the current week, right? Their S&OE could be just like 2 weeks, not 13 weeks. Because 13 weeks is their long-term forecasting horizon, right? For a fast food, kind of a casual fast food restaurant like a Subway, that type of stuff.
Yeah, I think it depends on the nature of your business. I'm thinking of a pharmaceutical company customer of ours. They make drugs for rare diseases. They typically had, of course, pretty stable demand patterns. You're not going to expect a spike in that, but doctors were essentially pantry loading their drugs. So you're not going to change your process for that. They just dealt with those changes based on repositioning inventory. You're not going to redo your demand plan. But when you're dealing with the QSR business, the fast food business or short-term retail or any business where you absolutely do not want to have stockouts, you're going to have greater agility built in because that's just a critical part of your business.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very, very good point. Very well made, yeah. Okay, so basically, I think, let me summarize this with, okay. So I like this wheel chart, so I thought I had to put it there somewhere. So this kind of gives you the sequence of the overall process flow, right? It starts with the MPS, right? Master production schedule, right? And also looking at launch of new products, new packaging, right? So that could just change things as well, right? And that has to be revisited. And then look at address supply volatility, right? Supply volatility, because that's where you address the supply shortages. And you have to either just say no to the customer, or you may have to prioritize the customer if supply cannot be adjusted, right? I think it's almost pointless going back to the demand planning team to ask them to change the forecast for the next 4 weeks, right? Either customers get it, customers don't get it, because you already have a demand signal, right? And then you may have to prioritize. Some customers get products, some customers don't, right? If you have a supply shortage. And then address demand volatility, the point we talked about, whether it is a demand shift or a demand growth, how do we address this? Demand sensing, customer fulfillment, right? And then decision to expedite supply to address major demand spikes and feedback to MPS and S&OP, right? With this process on a weekly basis, you would be feedbacking to make the schedule changes in the overall process, right? In the MPS itself, live update of the schedule, right? And then back to long-term supply visibility, right? And the long-term supply visibility feeds back into the S&OP process, okay? So in summary, S&OE is on a weekly cadence, right? Every week you do this, the executional plan, address exceptions, address all aspects of the execution over the next 13 weeks. So it's weekly, right? Every week you do this, but over the next 13 weeks is your horizon. It's a weekly cycle. And then finally report out to S&OP. So in terms of the summary, how the S&OP should be affected, that would be reported back to the S&OP. But what happens is, the S&OP happens only once a month, right? So adjustments in the middle is within the S&OE process. So. Okay. Very good. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I had one sort of, I don't know, question, comment,
Okay.
or just an example from early in my career at a manufacturer. We always, I mean, we hope we plan for perfect execution from the plants. That is, corporate planners prepare a plan out, and then we hope they make the production, and we can count on that in a timely
Right.
manner. In this instance, of course, everybody, as usual, was complaining about forecasting because of inventory issues or customer service issues and so on. But when we went in and measured it, we found out that there was as much error in the plant's execution of the plan that was sent to them as there was forecast error due to the incentives the plants were under, which was utilization of the production lines.
Right.
They didn't want to do changeovers, that sort of thing. So it's, I guess, more just kind of a
Schedule
warning out
adherence.
there of the kind of situations that throw a monkey wrench whenever we try to do something good.
Right.
There's always something bad we've got to fight against.
Right. Right.
I don't
So-
know if that's something you've seen commonly or if it's just particular to our organization.
I think it's, it's quite common actually. So that's the schedule adherence, right? In terms of, hey, I'm giving you the forecast. Are you making the forecast? Or are you making something different, right? So it could be below the forecast, right? Or it could be making more because you just wanted to improve the
Running
line
a long
efficiency.
production run, they want to do a big batch, and so they overbuilt.
Right. So that's quite common, right? And the other thing is schedule adherence. The other thing about schedule adherence is, in the near term though, if your demand is different from forecast, then they would produce to the demand, right? So when you have demand visibility, they'll produce to the demand. So that could potentially cause a exception to the the schedule adherence, right? So I think those are things that would be flagged in the S&OE, right? When those situations happen. Say S&OE is more about fulfillment, right? So if you are producing extra, it becomes an exception if it is going to affect the supply of some other product, right? Because you are just like running a large batch and you are piling inventory of a specific product or some products at the expense of something else that you need, right? So then that has to be flagged and sorted out through the S&OP process because it'll be an ongoing pain point, right? But true, very good point, yeah. That happens.
Hi, thanks. From your practical experience, where do you see companies? Sorry, where do you see companies successfully implementing S&OE? I mean, are we talking about Gartner S&OP maturity? Is this easily accessible to people, or do you need to wait in the maturity until you're level 3 or level 2? Because in particular, it links to S&OP. Or is this because, so many companies keep struggling with S&OP and to implement, to reach this even level 3? Is this something that might be easier to achieve? Or what are your views on that?
I would think S&OE is a savior for S&OP because, I think if you don't really have a formalized execution process, then that is going to compromise the S&OP, right? Because most of the S&OP, you're going to just really change and corrupt the S&OP to address some of these short-term exceptions. Right. So I would say, if things are chaotic and if S&OP is not functioning well, then one area to look at would be to formalize the sales and operations execution.
And looking at the definition now, I know when Gartner came out with S&OE to distinguish it clearly from S&OP, in your experience, do a lot of companies actually try to do S&OE while they're in fact thinking they're doing S&OP? Do they not mix up the horizons and the frequencies and everything?
I think there is a big momentum on the sales and operations execution, right? You can call it whatever name you want to, but the fact that it is coming under this umbrella, like sales and operations execution, I think companies are are flocking to it. They like the idea. They like because they understand what type of operational fires are happening in their process, the daily, weekly process. And, and this one gives you a very formal methodology to address those issues, right? So there is a lot of momentum, particularly in the US, there is a lot of momentum towards S&OE. So I'm glad that whoever came up with the buzzword, they did the right thing. Because, if you don't have a buzzword, right, it's difficult for management to catch on.
Very important, yeah.
Very important, because you can just say, hey, massive production scheduling, let's go back there. And then let's try to do massive production scheduling better, right? That's boring. That's from the 1960s, right?
Yeah, but this has a distinct and unique flavor, which is slightly different than S&OP or IBP or however you want to call financial integration. So I wonder, I mean, you're a consultant, but you're also a tool vendor. What kind of tools would we need, or what kind of tools exist in order to support S&OE? And we have another tool vendor here, of course, a sponsor. Because I see very little in tools that actually support S&OP or IBP, from a workflow perspective and from other things. Do we need different tools? Are there tools? I mean, any views on that?
I mean, I would say the current tool sets, we have done this with, simple tools like, it could be a data visualization tool. Because at the end of the day, you are just looking for exceptions, right? So it could be as easy as, you could just kind of we have defined this in Power BI, right? So it could be Power BI, Tableau, right? Any of those data visualizations, because your data is already existing, right? But the change process, right? That's where it's important, because you're going to make a schedule update, the change to schedule, live update to the schedule, right? So tools like Kinaxis, which does the concurrent planning, scenario planning to evaluate different exceptions. I think that's an option. So there are tools that exist. You have to implement it right. Right. So.
Right, thanks.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.